Our next speaker is Professor Sandosh Padmanabhan, who is the Professor of Cardiovascular Genomics and Therapeutics at the University of Glasgow. He's also an honorary consultant physician at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Glasgow, and he comes from a clinical pharmacology background, so slightly different to the previous speaker. His research interest is in hypertension and pharmacogenomics, and he's been given the exciting title of Scotland, which hopefully relates to pharmacogenomics implementation in Scotland. Sandosh.
Thank you. At the outset, I'd like to thank Sir Munir and the UK PGX network for inviting me to present. And I'm going to speak on pharmacogenomics in Scotland, which until a few years ago, it was considered a good idea. We had only a few variants, DPYD and RNR, as part of pharmacogenomics in Scotland. I'm going to give you our real-world experience in trying to implement pharmacogenomics. And this is not on the background of huge investment and infrastructure in genomics in Scotland at a population scale, as we've seen in England in the previous lecture. So I'm going to talk three examples. One is a living lab example. The other is Tayside, clopidogrel CYP2C19 successful implementation in one health board. And I'll end with a national strategy on pharmacogenomics. So just to give you a background to the Living Lab. The Living Laboratory was funded by UKRI Strength in Places Fund in the middle of 2020 at the height of lockdown. We received about £38 million from UKRI, and along with partner contributions, we now have about 90 million. And the aim of the Living Laboratory is implementation of precision medicine into the NHS, realizing value to patients, to the NHS and the community, and most importantly, economic growth in the region. There are multiple projects under the Living Lab banner, but the flagship project is the first one, enabling adoption, which is pharmacogenomics-informed medication management. We started on a blank slate to develop this program, and we realized early on that the first thing we realized is that there is no off-the-shelf solution for pharmacogenomics that could be implemented into the NHS. Then there were questions about whether we do preemptive, point of care, reactive. What do we do? Do we do genome sequencing? Do we do panels? Do we do single gene pair genotyping? And so all those questions. So we didn't have a single answer. There was accruing evidence. Pharmacogenomics, an exciting field, a lot of development in the last few years. We've got knowledge bases, we've got a lot of attempts at clinical decision support system, most of them single gene variants, but there were quite a few panel CDSs available. And on the implementation side, as we heard in the previous lecture, it's complex. We need patients involved, we need the NHS involved, we need industry involvement, education, physician or practitioner acceptability of this. And the biggest worry is from GPs and secondary care doctors is it going to increase my workload? I don't know genetics. So it was on this background, we thought, how do we implement pharmacogenomics? The Living Lab program was 5 years. Our deliverable was an implementable solution. So we discussed with the NHS and decided we need to have a strategy that would deliver this, because we want the NHS to accept any solution that we produce. And the NHS also recognized that there was no off-the-shelf solution, some innovation was required, and they advised us to follow this pathway, the Innovation Partnership Procurement Pathway. This has been used only once in Scotland, and it's quite a nice pathway wherein both the NHS and the industry or the vendor benefits. So it's quite fast track. It takes about 1 to 3 years. And the NHS identifies a need, and recognizing that there is no fully developed solution, it goes out to tender. They select the preferred bidder, and the NHS and the bidder work together to produce a solution that's acceptable to the NHS. And the reward at the end of this is, in contrast to the usual NHS bidding practice, is at the end of the time frame, which is agreed between the bidder and the NHS, let's say 3 years, if the bidder provides a fully implementable solution, then that automatically goes into the NHS framework for a fixed period of time. So in a sense, it's like the investment and the time taken by the bidder to build the solution guarantees at least a 5-year exclusive implementation or adoption within the NHS. So it's attractive, and it's also quite appropriate for pharmacogenomics. So we got this going, and some of you may have seen this tender came out in November 2021, and the tender stated that the requirement, so the pain point, the solution the NHS wanted was to optimize the polypharmacy program. They realized the huge burden polypharmacy has on people, on the healthcare system, and they said, okay, find a solution using pharmacogenomics to reduce the risk of polypharmacy and the burden of polypharmacy. And it's quite a big tender, £66 million tender for this service. If you look into the tender process, the requirements, what the NHS wanted to accept the solution, they needed evidence. So this is polypharmacy or multiple medicines. They need to show the bidder to show that there is evidence of efficacy, that it actually improves outcomes. And that's straightforward for polypharmacy. If you optimize treatment, you can improve outcome. But they wanted us to show evidence of efficacy. They wanted education of practitioners and patients. There has to be acceptability. Physicians, pharmacists need to know that such a test exists and how to order the test and what to do with the test. They were very clear that they needed the laboratory and the clinical decision support system to work harmoniously, and the whole system should not add any burden on the practitioners. It has to be integrated into primary and secondary care IT systems, and value. There has to be clear cost effectiveness, clear cost benefit rather to the NHS. They said this, you have to deliver all this by 30 months. They reduced from 36 months to 30 months. By 30 months, you deliver all this, then you get a contract. So that's been ongoing, and this is where we are. Because it's still ongoing, the procurement, we've not even selected a bit, the procurement is still ongoing, and it's very challenging. And this is reality. So in the meantime, our friends in Dundee, this was actually driven by a pharmacist who found that clopidogrel CYP2C19 being prescribed without genotyping. And they got together and decided, let's show that preemptive genotyping of CYP2C19 and clopidogrel in the stroke clinic will benefit patients. So they did a very small study, 700 patients in the stroke clinic. They genotyped and showed a quarter of the patients got their clopidogrel or the medicine the antiplatelet optimized. They demonstrated that this would lead to about 16 MACE events prevented, and they had calculated some cost savings, assuming the majority of the events avoided were stroke. This was enough for NHS Tayside to implement or adopt clopidogrel CYP2C19 pharmacogenetics test as a permanent service for the stroke clinic. Currently, it's used in the stroke clinic only, but they are planning to scale this to other drugs that are metabolized by CYP2C19. The most important bit in this slide is this one, the last one, submitted for national adoption through the ANIA pathway. So of course, this is a single SNP, single gene, single drug test. In the era of panel testing and sequencing, this may not be useful, but this was a successful adoption by the NHS. And the ANIA pathway is important because that gives us some insight into what the government wants. So these slides are courtesy Dame Anna, who's the chief scientist of Scotland. And this is the Scottish view. Scotland, they now have a national view on a strategy for healthcare, and they have recognized that innovations are not getting adopted or implemented soon. There's a huge bureaucracy involved, and they want to fast-track innovations for patient benefit quickly. And that means bringing key decision makers together into a single process that would lead to nationwide adoption in one go. And that's this Once for Scotland approach. And the ANIA pathway is the main pathway by which they feed these innovations directly to national adoption and pace. So that's the accelerated national innovation adoption pathway, where you have all the decision makers, including the government, identifying innovations which could come from NHS test beds. It can come directly from the industry, or it could be horizon scanned and identified by the government or other stakeholders and brought into triage, and in a very clear, structured manner. They get the innovator or the company or the inventor to track this through to innovation. And the success of this would be if they can get innovations accepted to clinical practice and without going through each health board and trying to negotiate with each health board for adoption. So the directive from the government is that all innovations, everything should go along this pathway. And they want to see rapid implementation and nothing being held due to bureaucracy or other reasons. So finally, nationally, again, Scotland is developing a national sort of strategy, and they have a Scottish National Strategic Network for Genomic Medicine. The interesting thing and what's heartening is because of all the work that we've been doing, like what NHS Tayside have been doing, what we've been doing at the Living Lab, pharmacogenomics has come on the radar of the national group. So now they have included pharmacogenomics as one of the key components in their national strategy. So that's useful, and things are moving forward with government interest, government recognition that pharmacogenomics need to be implemented. But there are challenges, and as we heard in the last slide, last speaker, there are challenges, and this has all been recognized. But what they are trying to do is to make sure that we develop solutions for genomic medicine across Scotland, and that's infrastructure, capacity building. But specifically for pharmacogenomics, we need standardized protocols, clinical decision support. That's the only way frontline practitioners can make full use of PGX. Health economics is critical, and that has to be at the center of delivery strategy. That's important. But there are some counter arguments in pharmacogenomics. Can we really get good evidence of health economics early on? Because it probably take a long, long time. So there's some discussions about that, but it's very clear that we are not going to get anything adopted if we can't show that cost savings. And also look at what's happening in the other nations. So NHS England, far advanced in areas where we could tap into and collaborate and share resources. And we need to seriously look at embedding PGX education into all training. So I'll stop there, and thank you for listening.